I caught my wife sneaking out of the company party with a strange man, so I followed them. She smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years, as if she were alive for the first time since our wedding day. That smile paralyzed me more than the kiss I saw happen a few minutes later, hidden between the cars, under the warm lights of an almost empty parking lot. They embraced like two ancient lovers, as if this were a celebration of something deeper than simple betrayal. And then, when they kissed with that calmness of someone who owes nothing to anyone, my heart broke in silence. I felt something inside me die slowly, as if each beat that kept pulsing was a mockery of the life I thought I had. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't go to them. I went back to the party room, finished a glass of wine forgotten on the table, smiled at my colleagues, and planned the most epic divorce she could receive right there. But what I didn't expect was that, in the midst of the chaos, I would meet someone again who would completely change everything. Because the lawyer she hired to represent her in the separation, was the great love that I one day left behind. Life is ironic in its surgical precision. At the same time that the betrayal was crushing me inside, an old flame resurfaced, not with youthful intensity, but with a maturity that hurt with the same intensity. While she wrote the end of our story with furtive kisses, life scribbled at the bottom of the page the beginning of something even bigger for me. But before that, there was the anger, the grief, the disgust at every detail that I relived, trying to understand where everything started to fall apart. It wasn't the cold smiles on Sunday mornings, nor the hurried kisses at the front door. It was her lost look during conversations, as if I were nothing more than a distant echo in her life. I asked myself so many times what else I could have done. What was missing? Sex. Trips. Dialogues. And then I understood, it was never about me. It was about her. About her thirst for newness, for validation, for feeling desired as if time had stopped in her early 20s. She wanted to be looked at like at that first party where we met, she wanted to be desired without commitment, touched without promises. And at that time, I was already a promise fulfilled. Coming home that night was like walking through a graveyard of dreams. Every photo on the walls, every pillow on the couch, every dish in the kitchen was a reminder of the farce I was living. When she walked in the door the next morning, looking like a tired wife, she didn't even realize I knew. He smiled, kissed me on the cheek like he always did, and asked if I had slept well. I smiled back. The monster that was born inside me fed on calm. I prepared the coffee, served it as I did every morning, and let her believe for a few more days that everything was fine. Meanwhile, I planned. In detail. Cold, calculating. I turned every good memory into an emotional weapon. I mapped her every weakness, every attachment. I knew where it hurt. And she would find out. I found out who the lover was. I found out where he lived, where he worked, who he interacted with. And no. He wasn't just any stranger. It was someone close, much closer than I would like to admit. It made my blood boil, but it also gave me ammunition. Discovering that she was risking marriage for someone who crossed our social circles was the final blow. And then came the day she announced that she wanted to talk. That she thought we should give ourselves a break, that she was confused, that she needed to rediscover herself. Ah, the nerve. As if I were the obstacle to your happiness. I accepted, with a bitter smile, and said I agreed. That I also thought something in me needed to change. But she didn't know that what I wanted to change was the address where she lived, the freedom she thought she would have, and the financial comfort she had enjoyed until that moment. It was there that I started preparing for what I called my epic divorce. And nothing she knew would be preserved. The plan took concrete form when I received contact from the law firm that she would hire to handle the separation. It was a familiar name, but it seemed common to me until, when I opened the door to the meeting room, everything stopped. Years of stored memories exploded in seconds. It was her. The love of youth that I let slip away due to stupid decisions, out of pride, out of fear of assuming feelings that at the time seemed too fragile. And now she was here, representing the woman who had broken my heart. Our eyes met and, at that moment, everything got confused. The past screamed, while the present bled. But what surprised me was not just the reunion, but the way she looked at me, with pain and tenderness, as if she was seeing something inside me that no one else saw. She read my eyes like someone reading an old book with a torn cover. She knew. He knew what I felt before I even opened my mouth. It didn't take long for us to understand that separation, which had everything to be a cold and legal process, would become an emotional reunion of unexpected proportions. I never planned on finding love again amid the rubble of a failed marriage, but fate has a cruel sense of humor. And while my ex-wife tried to negotiate advantageous clauses, while she demanded pension, division of assets, and dragged our name through exhausting meetings, I was rebuilt by each conversation outside the meeting room with that woman who, one day, broke my heart because the timing wasn't right. Now, maybe it was. But everything had to be done with precision. I couldn't give in easily. I needed to honor my pain. I needed to show the traitor that not only would I survive, but I would flourish in front of her. The most powerful revenge is not the one that destroys. It is the one that shows that we have been freed. When she started to realize that there was something between me and the lawyer, the mask fell. Desperation appeared between the lines of emails, in passive-aggressive messages, in the looks during the hearing. Realizing that I was losing control of the narrative, that I wouldn't drag myself out asking for explanations, was the trigger for the real breakdown. And there, in front of the woman she hired to defeat her, she saw the worst defeat, me being reborn. Because nothing hurts more for someone who betrays than realizing that the betrayed person has found what she can never offer, a love that springs from mutual respect and sincerity. The divorce was completed with minimal losses for me. She left with less than she expected, and much more empty than she planned. As for me, I left with less anger than I imagined, and with much more love than I dreamed of. And all because the universe made a point of bringing together the past with the present at a time when I most needed to remember who I was before I was betrayed. But was this reunion just a coincidence of fate? Or was there something even deeper behind this sudden return of someone who seemed to have disappeared from my life forever? Because, at the end of the process, when everything seemed resolved, an unexpected revelation fell like lightning at the last divorce meeting. A revelation that not only changed the course of my story, but exposed that betrayal, perhaps was caused by something that I myself forgot I had ever done. What if, in the end, the betrayed person is also partly to blame for the betrayal? Is the true villain of the story the one who cheats, or the one who opened the door for this to happen without realizing it? Now everything that felt right falls apart before me. The reunion with the past brought to light truths that I thought I had buried. And the worst thing of all is that maybe, this lawyer didn't come back by chance. Perhaps she came back with a much deeper, and more personal, purpose than I could have ever imagined. What if I told you that she's hiding a secret about my past, something that could turn this story completely upside down? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, romanticize or justify any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fiction, but based on painful realities, created to show how infidelity can destroy lives, homes, and hearts. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of twists and turns, where every choice has a price. Take a deep breath, because what comes now is a shocking story. At the end of a year of intense professional growth, the consulting company where Ethan worked was organizing one of the most anticipated parties of the season. Located on an elegant rooftop in the city's financial center, the event brought together strategic partners, directors, investors, and a few personal guests of high-ranking employees. Ethan was a project manager, a man recognized for his calm intelligence, calm leadership, and the respectful way in which he treated everyone around him. At 38 years old, he was at the height of his career, with an enviable CV, a solid reputation and a personal life that, from the outside looking in, seemed entirely resolved. Married for 8 years to Olivia, an architect with a delicate look and restrained speech, his life seemed like a well-organized framework of emotional and professional success. Together, they lived in a refined loft, a space that mixed the sober lines of concrete with the artistic touch of plants and paintings hand-picked by her, who since her adolescence found her greatest refuge in details. They had no children, by mutual choice. They preferred to travel, work, reinvent themselves as a couple, and always said that the world was already full enough. The truth, however, was deeper than this simplistic explanation. In the early years, Ethan and Olivia were a fascinating couple. There was a natural rhythm between them, a fit that didn't require effort. They talked fluently, exchanged glances that spoke more than words, and had a chemistry that was difficult to explain. She was passionate about her ideas, he was passionate about the way she saw beauty in things that no one else noticed. They took short trips on the weekends, created their own rituals, such as having dinner listening to old vinyl, dancing barefoot in the living room on rainy nights, or simply lying on the carpet and reading books side by side. Fights were rare and, when they did happen, they ended with long conversations and intense reconciliations. But time, that silent worker that changes the order of things, has been wearing away invisible parts of the relationship. Olivia began to dive more into work after the third year of marriage. His office grew, with big projects, awards and international trips. Meanwhile, Ethan moved up in another direction, taking on more strategic roles and expanding his network of influence in the corporate world. Agendas began to clash, Sunday lunches became the exception, trips together were replaced by isolated commitments. And even though the love was still there, the constant presence gave way to a confusing longing that didn't hurt enough to confront, but silently created holes in the structure. It was as if they lived in the same house, but in parallel realities that crossed paths less and less. And the strangest thing was that, despite this, they continued to admire each other. Ethan was still looking at Olivia like someone looking at a work of art that he no longer knows how to interpret. Olivia, in turn, felt a kind of melancholic affection for the man who once made her world go round, but who was now an all too predictable safe haven. In social environments, they were seen as the perfect couple. Educated, elegant, balanced. They made a point of attending events together, even if they were exhausted. Ethan knew that a lot of people envied him, and there were times when that fueled his pride, but there was also an emptiness that grew whenever he looked at Olivia and couldn't read her anymore. She was different, more introspective, sometimes too absent. There were no arguments, just a silence too comfortable to be healthy. And no matter how much he tried to start deep conversations, propose trips, arrange dinners in places they frequented at the beginning of their relationship, everything always seemed to be kindly refused due to a tight schedule or insistent tiredness. Ethan began to doubt himself, his own power of connection. He wondered if he had missed something, if he was forgetting how to love, or worse, if he was being forgotten. Olivia, in turn, struggled with dilemmas she couldn't name. There were days when she would look at Ethan and feel a tenderness that made her want to hug him for hours. But there were others where everything about him seemed distant, as if he were behind a glass curtain, unreachable. She missed the lightness that existed in the beginning, the conversations without an agenda, the spontaneous laughter. But I didn't know how to redeem that without seeming ungrateful for everything they'd built. At the same time, her professional growth pressured her to constantly reinvent herself. His mind was racing, connected to ideas, schedules, meetings. Love was there, but tucked away in a corner, like a plant that survives even without being watered for days. And she honestly believed that that kind of mature love was normal after so many years. He didn't talk about his discomforts, just as Ethan kept his own. Both pretended that this warm balance was maturity. It wasn't. It was fear of looking into each other's eyes and admitting that something had changed. The company party was organized by Ethan months in advance. He had dedicated himself to it as if it were his personal reconnection project. He wanted Olivia to be there, he wanted her to see how valued, admired, influential he was. Perhaps he wanted to remind the woman who inspired him of the man she once chose. Olivia agreed to go even though she was exhausted from an important launch at her office. She arrived late, with an impeccable dress and a polite smile. He greeted Ethan's colleagues with kindness, praised the atmosphere, drank a glass of sparkling wine and always remained 1 meter away from him. Ethan noticed, but pretended not to notice. He tried to involve her in conversations with the directors, introduced her to investors, spoke enthusiastically about his latest success stories. Olivia smiled, said what was necessary, but her gaze wandered, as if looking for a window to escape to another place. At one point, he said he needed air and walked away from the group. Ethan watched from afar, trying to decipher her expression. She seemed too calm. He didn't think she knew how to lie, but there was something about that smile that didn't suit the woman he knew. Still, he didn't want to give in to jealousy, he didn't want to be that kind of man. He waited a few minutes and went back to socializing, forcing an enthusiasm he didn't feel. But something inside him remained restless, like a spark about to turn into a fire. He decided to look for her, walk through the lounge, the bar, the stairs. And it was on this journey that something changed forever. But not yet at that moment. What Ethan saw when he turned down the hallway that led to the side access of the building was just a shadow moving away. An elegant female figure next to an unknown male silhouette. There was no touch, no rush, just the synchronicity of two bodies accustomed to walking together without arousing suspicion. He followed instinct, but something held him back. Perhaps the fear of what I would find, perhaps the fear of transforming into real what was still just a discomfort. He returned to the party with a lump in his throat and the feeling of being slowly excluded from his own life. Olivia returned 20 minutes later, saying that she had received an urgent call from the office and needed to go downstairs to resolve it. Ethan just nodded, asking no questions. It wasn't the time. In the following days, he tried to resume his routine with more attention. I woke up early to prepare coffee, left sweet notes on the bathroom mirror, sent messages in the middle of the day. Olivia thanked her, smiled, but didn't reciprocate with the same intensity. There was a gap between them that no kindness could bridge. And that's when the invitation to the divorce meeting arrived. Subtly, elegantly, the way Olivia did everything. She asked them to talk, said that she needed to think about herself, that she felt they were growing apart and that perhaps some time was needed. Ethan, as always, was rational. He listened, reflected, and instead of begging, he agreed. But inside, something was breaking violently. It was that same day that the call from the law firm arrived. The assistant provided the name of the lawyer who would represent Olivia in the case. Ethan froze. The name was a ghost from the past, one he never forgot. Her heart raced, and it wasn't because of the divorce. It was for something he didn't understand, yet. Something that would completely change what he thought he was living. And the moment he entered that meeting room, time stopped. Because sometimes, the past doesn't knock on the door, it breaks down. The meeting room was paneled in light wood and frosted glass, smelling of freshly brewed coffee and professional neutrality. Ethan arrived 10 minutes before the scheduled time, as was his habit, and sat at one end of the long table. He was dressed with the discreet sobriety he wore in moments of greatest pressure, dark gray suit, white shirt without tie, impeccably polished shoes. His hands were steady on the table, but inside, his stomach was churning with memories and anticipation. When the door opened and Olivia's lawyer walked in, the world seemed to spin in slow motion. There she was, Ava, the woman he hadn't seen in over a decade. The hair was darker, the look more mature, but there was an undeniable shine that remained the same. She didn't hide her surprise, nor did she let it turn into embarrassment. He greeted him with a slight nod and a restrained smile. And in less than 2 minutes, the entire story that they had lived, and that was never truly closed, imposed itself like a third character at that table. Ethan couldn't decide if this was an irony of fate or a cruel trick of chance. But he couldn't allow old feelings to cloud the present moment. He was there to face one of the most difficult chapters of his life, and Ava was, strange as it seemed, the bridge between the end and some possible beginning. In the following meetings, the looks became longer, the silences more charged. The formality remained intact, but there was a subtext between them that not even time could erase. Ethan found himself observing her gestures, remembering afternoons in university libraries, cafes on cloudy days, notes folded in half that carried intimate secrets. Ava, in turn, perceived in the man in front of her the evolution of that idealistic boy she had loved, but who at the time didn't have the courage to follow. Life had separated them for reasons greater than pride, different paths, choices, times. But there they were, sitting across from each other, as the wreckage of Ethan's relationship with Olivia piled up in cold documents, clauses, attachments, and deadlines. Olivia did not attend meetings. She said she was busy, leaving everything in the lawyer's hands. He sent short, polite messages to Ethan, informing practical decisions, avoiding any kind of emotional conversation. That bothered him in a way he didn't expect. How was it possible that a story spanning almost a decade ended so coldly? One afternoon when Olivia was late signing documents at the company, Ethan decided to do something he normally wouldn't do. He called her cell phone. After a few rings, she answered with a muffled voice. She seemed irritated and hurried. She said she was in transit, that they would sort it out later, and hung up before he could ask anything. It wasn't just the dry response, it was the tone, the reaction time, the feeling that there was something carefully hidden. He tried not to create theories, but his instinct told him something wasn't being said. He began to notice details, the change in her perfume, the frequent delays, the clothes that were a little more daring for her usual style. It wasn't the possessive or irrational kind of jealousy, it was a subtle but persistent uneasiness. He knew Olivia better than anyone, and he knew she was distant, not just emotionally, but on another level. One night, returning home earlier than usual, Ethan noticed that the front door was ajar. The sound of the shower running echoed in the back of the apartment. On the sofa, a glass of wine is still cold. He climbed the stairs without making a sound. Olivia came out of the shower minutes later, wearing a light nightgown, and when she saw him there, she gave a slight start. She said she thought he would be home later, that she was just relaxing, that she needed some time to herself. Ethan didn't respond. He watched her, memorized every detail of that moment, and felt an abyss open between them. Little by little, curiosity gave way to silent investigation. Ethan wasn't one for impulsive confrontations, he preferred logic and planning. He began to observe Olivia's output patterns, the times, the message intervals. She wrote down the data mentally, cross-referencing the information with the days she said she was at night meetings or client dinners. Before long, he realized that some versions didn't match. One night, she left claiming an urgent meeting with a partner construction company. He said he might not be back early. He just nodded, and a few hours later, he drove to the area where she said she was. He parked the car discreetly and waited. For more than an hour, nothing happened. He was already thinking about leaving when he saw Olivia's figure rushing out of a car that wasn't hers. Hugging a tall man wearing a dark blazer and jeans, she smiled and kissed his cheek with an intimacy that Ethan had never seen even in her oldest friends. Then, the two walked side by side to a side entrance of a commercial building. Ethan remained motionless, as if his muscles had refused to react. There was no scandal, no direct blatant, but everything was there, designed with the precision of a stroke. He closed his eyes for a moment and thought that maybe he was wrong, that there could all be a reasonable explanation. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. In the days that followed, Ethan acted as if nothing had happened. He continued responding to Ava's emails, participating in meetings, resolving company issues. But in his mind, everything was collapsing. He began to have difficulty sleeping, his concentration fluctuated, and his heart felt heavy at random times of the day. He thought about confronting Olivia, but something inside him stopped him. Maybe it was pride, maybe the desire to understand where this was going. And then, a new opportunity presented itself. Ethan's company was hosting a special platform launch event, and all employees were invited along with their guests. Olivia, even with the divorce underway, confirmed her presence. He said it would be good to keep up appearances and avoid gossip. Ethan agreed. Internally, I knew that night would be decisive. Something would happen. And he would be ready. The party took place in a modern room, decorated with amber lights and interactive panels. Ethan circulated among the guests naturally, but his eyes were constantly looking for Olivia. When she arrived, she was stunning. She wore a dark red dress, loose hair and striking makeup. He greeted him with a cold kiss on the cheek and a mechanical smile. They talked briefly, like professional colleagues. For hours, Ethan watched her walk away, laugh, circle. At one point, she exchanged long glances with a man near the bar, and Ethan immediately recognized the silhouette of the car she had gotten out of weeks ago. Something inside him snapped. The man approached discreetly, and the two exchanged a few words. Ethan pretended not to see. Waited. Minutes later, Olivia signaled that she needed to leave to take a call. She picked up her bag and walked to the side exit of the room. The man followed behind, keeping a comfortable distance. Ethan waited about 30 seconds and followed them. The hallway was empty, lit by indirect lights. Outside, the night was cool, silent. And then he saw them. Standing near the parking lot, Olivia and the man laughed quietly. She placed her hand on his shoulder, and then he cupped her face with both hands and kissed her. It wasn't a quick kiss, nor a nervous one. It was a calm, intimate kiss, like someone who has time, like someone who has a story. Ethan didn't react. Just watched. He felt the weight of that moment drain from his chest, as if his soul was being slowly ripped out. Every detail was recorded with precision, the movement of her fingers in the man's hair, the way their bodies leaned towards each other. When the kiss ended, the two smiled naturally and said goodbye as if it were common. She turned back toward the lounge, and he toward the parking lot. Ethan came back inside like a ghost. He greeted some colleagues, took his jacket and left without saying goodbye. As he got into the car, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw his own reflection, a man who until recently thought he had control over his life. But there, in that mirror, was a stranger. The next morning, Olivia pretended to be normal. He said the party was great, that everyone was commenting on the impeccable organization. Ethan listened to her in silence, and then said he would prefer the next meeting to be in person. She nodded, and it was at that moment that he arranged the meeting that would seal the turning point. When he walked into the room with Ava the next morning, he was no longer the same man. And what she discovered in that meeting, what she heard coming from the woman who now represented the other, was something she could never have imagined. And no, it wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about what was behind it. About something that came from long before, and that was now coming back to exact a price he never thought he would have to pay. The meeting room that day felt different, more tense, as if the air inside was charged with some invisible electricity. Ava was already waiting for him, sitting composedly, a folder in front of her and a look that oscillated between professional restraint and emotional restlessness. Ethan entered in silence, left his jacket hanging on the chair and sat down opposite her, taking his time, as if he needed to prepare for something he didn't yet know the size of. Olivia would be here in a few minutes, they said. And the two of them, in that suspended interval of time, stared at each other with an intensity that no words could sustain. Ava cleared her throat, adjusted her posture, and then murmured that she needed to talk to him alone before the meeting started. Ethan just nodded. He was not a man of excessive gestures. But I knew that what came next was not trivial. She closed the folder, folded her hands over it, and for a moment she hesitated, as if she had gone back in time, as if that reunion had unearthed not just memories, but something deeper, something never resolved. He said that what he needed to tell her was not in the documents, nor was it part of the divorce itself, but was directly linked to why she agreed to represent Olivia, even without knowing that her ex-husband would be him. Ethan frowned, still confused. Ava took a deep breath and began to weave the words together with surgical precision, but her voice carried a weight that wasn't often heard. She said that, months before being approached by Olivia, she received a message on her social networks. It was from a woman called Bianca, who said she was a close friend of Olivia and who said she had something very delicate to reveal. The content of that message had sat dormant in Ava's inbox for weeks, until Olivia herself got in touch, proposing that she be her divorce lawyer. The coincidence raised the alarm. Ava then decided to open and read the message carefully. The woman talked about a past that involved Ethan and Olivia, and mentioned something he might never have suspected, that their marriage had begun not just out of love, but out of something built on omissions and resentment. Ethan, still silent, felt his breathing quicken. Ava continued. She said she was intrigued, so she decided to investigate on her own, even before the first official meeting. And what he discovered would completely change the way he would view the last 8 years of his life. Ava revealed that during her senior year of college, when she and Ethan were still together, there was a get-together party that he didn't attend. I had an important project presentation, commitments with the supervising teachers. At that party, Olivia showed up, invited by a mutual friend. She wasn't close to the group, but she circulated discreetly at the same events. Ava said that night, an uncomfortable situation had happened. Olivia, after drinking more than she was used to, looked for information about Ethan, told colleagues that she had admired him for a long time, that she thought it was incredible how intelligent and centered he was, and that she didn't understand how someone like Ava had managed to hold a man like him. At the time, it just sounded like an evil phrase, uttered by someone impaired by alcohol. But now, with the pieces being put together, Ava began to see what was behind it. Olivia had purposefully approached Ethan. And it wasn't by chance. Ava opened an envelope and pulled out an old newspaper clipping. It was from an article about the award Ethan received in his first year of work after college. In the same article, in the background, there was a woman smiling, with an intern badge pinned to her blouse. It was Olivia. She was there before Ethan even knew who she was. And then came the most devastating revelation. Olivia was hired as an assistant in the same department where Ethan worked right after graduation. And not only that, the position was obtained through Bianca, the friend who sent the message. Bianca was Ava's cousin. Ethan paled. He began to connect the dots in silence. Ava followed, firm, even though her heart felt like it was about to break. She said that, in the months leading up to the end of her and Ethan's relationship, Olivia was subtly getting closer, showing interest in the same subjects, being helpful, appearing in the same places. When Ava and Ethan broke up, Olivia appeared shortly after as a shoulder to lean on. As someone who got what he needed. And she knew how to be everything Ava wasn't at that moment. Ethan interrupted. He asked if this was some kind of conspiracy. Ava sadly replied that no, it wasn't a Machiavellian plan, but something worse. She was a frustrated woman, who wanted to live a life that wasn't hers, who spent years building a perfect character, molded to be irresistible exactly to him. Who studied your habits, your pains, your dreams, and used them as a key to enter. Olivia hadn't stolen Ethan from Ava, but she had won him from the wound opened by that separation. She waited for the right time, inserted herself with precision, and became everything he was looking for, because she already knew exactly what that was. And then came the last blow. Ava removed a folded sheet of paper from her purse and slowly slid it across the table. It was an email exchange between Olivia and Bianca, dated 5 years ago. In it, Olivia said that she regretted everything, that there were moments when she felt real love for Ethan, but that she couldn't pretend anymore. That she was tired of living a life that wasn't hers. That she could no longer stand being next to a man who saw in her a woman she never really was. She also said that she planned to look for something that made her feel alive, as she felt like an imposter within that marriage. Ethan read each line as if they were blades slowly entering. The truth was there. It wasn't just cheating with another man. It was the deepest betrayal of all. He had been deceived from the beginning. The woman with whom he shared his life had built every step of the relationship based on a silent obsession. And he, for so long, believed he was experiencing real love, when in fact it was just part of an emotional experiment fueled by vanity and frustration. When Olivia finally entered the room, she found the two of them silent. Ethan held the folded paper, breathing heavily. She approached, confident, as if it were just another step in the bureaucratic process. But what he found was the look of a man who had just emerged from the ruins of an illusion. He looked at her, firmly, and asked if at least some of it had been true. Olivia tried to maintain her composure, saying he was being dramatic, that he didn't understand the complexities of everything they had experienced. Ethan then handed over the sheet, without saying anything. Olivia paled. She tried to take his hand, but he had already moved away. Ava remained silent, watching. Olivia, faced with those words written by her own hand years before, tried to deny it. He said that it was a phase, that it was misinterpreted, that he didn't remember exactly. But it was too late. The mask had fallen. Ethan got up, picked up his jacket and, before leaving, he just said that he understood everything now. And that, for the first time in many years, I didn't feel angry. I felt relief. Because the pain of loving a lie was already too great. And now that the truth was out, he finally felt free. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken. The breeze was gentle, but there was no peace. Just the certainty that something had truly ended. And what would come next, was still unknown. Olivia remained standing next to the table, paralyzed, holding the paper with trembling hands, as if there was still any chance of erasing those words with the force of her gaze. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of noise that fills the body from the inside, that destroys the ground beneath your feet. Ava had left the room a few minutes after Ethan left, leaving Olivia alone with the weight of her own truth. Her shoes, so firm when she entered, now felt like 2 blocks of concrete. He sat up slowly, ran his hands over his face, trying to contain a stubborn tear that escaped with the same speed as the image of Ethan walking out of the room. For the first time, it wasn't the abandonment that hurt. It was the fact that she was finally seen for who she really was. The farce had been dismantled, and there were no more justifications available. The naked truth did not allow for narrative adjustments. Ethan didn't come home that night. He drove aimlessly for hours, taking in familiar streets and others he had never noticed. He stopped at a convenience station, bought an overly bitter coffee and stared into space. I tried to rescue some moment that could serve as an anchor, a pure, intact memory, something that escaped the contamination of that manipulative plot. Didn't find it. The memories now felt like a quilt sewn with false threads, a fabric that fell apart just by being touched. He felt exhausted, but not the kind of tiredness that sleep resolves. It was something deeper, as if every cell in his body carried the weight of years of deceit. At some point in the early hours of the morning, she parked in front of an inconspicuous hotel and rented a room for an indefinite period of time. I wanted distance from everything. Of furniture she chose, of clothes she folded, of her scent on the pillows. Over the next few days, he remained silent. You ignored links, uninstalled apps, turned off notifications. He let time slide by without rushing, without an agenda. His only constant was Ava. She respected his silence, but appeared with unexpected frequency, as someone who understands that presence, even mute, can save. One afternoon, she got some food and sat on the couch next to him, watching the rain run down the window. After a few minutes of silence, she released a sentence like someone pulling a splinter out of her chest. He said that he still thought about the two of them, that he hadn't looked for that he would never have gotten involved in the story if he had known who the client's ex-husband was. Ethan only responded with a brief look, but it carried no bitterness. There was a tacit recognition in his eyes that there, in that connection that stood the test of time, existed truth. It wasn't just the past trying to resurface. It was something more. Over time, the two returned to talking about topics other than pain. They talked about books, politics, documentaries. Laugh at stories from your college days. And in the midst of these exchanges, a subtle tenderness once again existed between them, a kind of silent reconciliation with life. Ava was firm but sensitive. He knew when to remain silent, when to provoke, when to move away and when to approach. Ethan rediscovered a lightness within himself that had been erased. It was like relearning how to breathe after years in a rarefied environment. Meanwhile, Olivia tried to rebuild some order within the chaos she had created. The mask had fallen, but life went on. In the office, his posture was as usual. He dressed impeccably, arrived punctually, resolved issues competently. But inside, she was a tangle of frustrations, fears, and anger at herself. He tried to convince himself that Ethan also had his share of the blame, that his distance in the marriage justified his choices. But no matter how much I repeated this narrative in my mind, I knew it was just a desperate attempt to escape my own responsibility. At home, the rooms seemed bigger. The silence that was once comfortable was now oppressive. Sleeping became difficult, eating became an obligation. She realized that Ethan's presence occupied spaces that she only understood now that they were empty. One day, without warning, he showed up at the building where Ethan was staying. He just asked for a conversation. The receptionist called the room, and he, after a few seconds of hesitation, allowed it. Olivia went upstairs, knocking lightly on the door. He opened it, emotionless. She entered slowly, as if stepping onto sacred ground. There were no flowers, no promises, no drama. Just two bodies marked by time and truth. Olivia started to speak. He said he wasn't there to win back, that he wasn't looking for forgiveness. I just wanted to explain. But what came out of his mouth was a succession of fragmented sentences, confused feelings, half-spoken truths. Ethan listened silently, as if analyzing a thesis. When she stopped, hoping for some reaction, he asked why. Not because he betrayed him, but because he built an entire life based on a lie. Olivia didn't know how to respond. He cried, softly, saying that, at first, he didn't know how much he was manipulating. Only later did she realize that she had become an actress in her own right. Ethan just thanked him for his belated honesty and opened the door. She left without protesting. A few days later, Ava invited Ethan to dinner. The restaurant was discreet, with low lighting and instrumental music. They talked like old friends, but there was something new between them, a good tension, a veiled desire for a fresh start. In the middle of the conversation, Ava paused, looked him in the eye and asked if he felt angry about everything that happened. He replied no more. I felt relief. I didn't need to pretend anymore. I no longer needed to keep up appearances. For the first time in years, he felt whole. Ava smiled, and there, between glasses of wine and suppressed laughter, something began to rebuild. Not as a repetition of the past, but as a new beginning. More weeks passed, and Olivia sent a letter. Not an email, not a cell phone message. A handwritten letter, with firm but painful handwriting. He said he was going to live in another city, that he had received a job offer. She said she left behind not just the apartment, but a version of herself that she could no longer bear to carry. He was grateful for the years, for the attempts, for the times he tried to save her even when she herself had already given up. And she asked that, if he were ever able to remember her, it wouldn't just be because of the pain. Ethan put the letter in a drawer. I didn't know if I would ever reread it. But he didn't tear it. Life resumed its course. Slowly. Ethan went back to work, met friends, and got back into the habit of running in the morning. And Ava, little by little, stopped being just a link with the past to become a constant presence in the present. They didn't talk about what they would be, they didn't put labels on them. They were just there, available, willing. One night, during a sunset, she held his hand, and he knew that it was not the end, but the true beginning. And in the comfortable silence that surrounded them, Ethan finally understood that the greatest revenge was not to destroy those who hurt him, but to rebuild himself in such a way that not even the memory of pain would be able to stop him from loving again. And there, in that moment when there were no masks, plans or manipulations, he finally took a deep breath, without guilt, without fear. For the first time in a long time, he was free. Ethan's new apartment still smelled of fresh paint and half-open boxes littered the corners. It wasn't big, nor luxurious, but it carried something he hadn't felt in a long time, belonging. The decision to move came not as an escape, but as a vital need for a fresh start. Every piece of furniture there had been chosen by him, every painting hanging on the wall reflected a part that had survived the storm. The old brown leather sofa, the bookshelf with yellowed books along the edges, the plants that he swore he would kill in a few days but that surprisingly remained alive, everything represented, in some way, the new man he allowed himself to be. And although the past left deep scars, there was an unexpected serenity in that transition phase. Ethan no longer woke up with the weight of uncertainty, nor did he sleep with the silent knot of betrayal pressing into his chest. But it wasn't lightness that I felt. It was consciousness. A presence full of oneself that, even crossed by pain, was truer than any love built on illusions. Ava was still present, but in no rush. The relationship between the two followed its own rhythm, like an old melody playing again with new chords. It didn't take up too much space, nor did it require definitions. There were days when they spent hours together and others when they only exchanged a brief message. There were no charges, just care. One night, while they were eating dinner on the porch, Ethan asked her if she believed forgiveness came over time or if it was a rational choice. Ava responded with a sideways smile that, sometimes, forgiveness didn't come at all, what came was the acceptance that it no longer needed to be carried. Ethan didn't respond, but he understood. Some pains cannot be cured. They just remain silent. He knew that he had forgiven Olivia in parts, not out of benevolence, but because hating her required an effort that no longer made sense. Anger was a dark room where he no longer wanted to live. And as much as his story with her was built on quicksand, there were also sincere moments that he couldn't deny. Accepting this without romanticizing it was one of the hardest lessons he had to learn. Olivia was gone. He left no address, no more letters. Just the apartment key in a white envelope, returned by some courier. In the short note that accompanied it, she wrote only that she wished him to find peace. Didn't sign. Ethan looked at it with unexpected emptiness. Part of him hoped for one last reckoning, an emotional farewell that would end the cycle with a dignified final point. But he understood that endings are not always the way we want them to be. Sometimes they just arrive, silent, incomplete, real. He kept the key in the bottom drawer of the kitchen cabinet, along with other souvenirs that he decided not to throw away. Not as a form of attachment, but as a reminder that all this had happened, and that surviving it was part of her new story. At work, things also changed. Ethan began to lead a new sector, with less exposure and more practical impact. He accepted the invitation not out of ambition, but out of a desire for transformation. I was tired of the superficiality of social events, of appearances cultivated for convenience. Now he was looking for meaning. I created projects that helped young professionals develop, offered mentoring, talked less and listened more. His colleagues found the change strange at first, but soon began to admire him even more. There was a gravity to him, a depth that hadn't existed before. As if he had been shaped inside by a pain that no one saw, but that had made him more human. Some colleagues knew about the divorce, but never asked for details. And he didn't offer them either. Not out of shame, but because telling that story was like reviving a fire. And some flames just need to be left behind. One morning, while walking through an old bookstore, he bumped into Bianca. The same woman who, without knowing it, had been the trigger for the truth. She was visibly embarrassed, but smiled gently. She asked if he was okay, and he said yes. They exchanged few words, but something in her posture made him realize that there was more behind that meeting than chance. Bianca hesitated for a second before saying that she carried guilt. That I never wanted to hurt anyone. That her intention in sending the message to Ava was not to cause pain, but to try to free a story that she knew was about to fall apart. Ethan didn't say anything. He just touched her shoulder and thanked her. Not because of the pain, but because of the courage to tell the truth. And that somehow sealed a cycle he didn't even know was still open. Over the next few months, he began writing. Not as a writer, but as someone who needed to organize the chaos within. He created short texts, reflections, chronicles without an addressee. And in each word, he left a piece of what he had learned. Betrayal, he understood, was not just the breaking of a marital pact. It was the revelation of hidden layers, both of others and of oneself. He discovered parts of himself that he would never have known if he hadn't been betrayed. He discovered pride disguised as humility, control disguised as emotional stability, fear hidden under the appearance of balance. And, most importantly, he discovered the silent courage to continue. There were no trophies, no applause. Just a man who decided not to be held hostage by what hurt him. One night, Ava invited him to a contemporary art exhibition. She knew he resisted this type of event, but she insisted. He said that maybe there he would find something he didn't know he needed. He went. They walked through colorful rooms, full of disconcerting installations. Ethan looked at everything with childish curiosity, laughing at the exaggerated interpretations of the other visitors. At one point, they stopped in front of a work made only of deformed mirrors. Each mirror reflected a distorted version of the person standing before it. Ava stood in front of one of them and said, with a half-smile, that perhaps that was the most honest image anyone could have of themselves. Ethan observed her and responded that, however distorted the image was, there was something real there, the attempt to see himself. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. When they returned home, they lay on the sofa, hugging each other, in no rush to say anything. The silence between them was different. It was not empty. It was presence. A safe space where you didn't have to explain yourself. Ethan looked at her and said that if he ever wrote about everything he experienced, he wouldn't start with the pain. I would start with the choice to continue. For the decision not to allow a lie to define your truth. Ava kissed him on the forehead and said that in this case, she wanted to be the epilogue. Not the ending, but the part that closes the story with dignity. He smiled and, for the first time in a long time, he felt something he didn't know was still possible, hope. However, even with everything heading towards this place of reconstruction, there was a restlessness that Ethan couldn't name. It wasn't about Olivia, nor about Ava. About what she would do with it all. About the need to give meaning to suffering. And, deep down, about the doubt that still lingered, was he just a victim? Or had he also created, even without meaning to, the perfect scenario to be betrayed? The answer was still unclear. But perhaps that was the greatest maturity possible, admitting that certain questions do not have absolute answers, only versions. And living with them, without getting lost, was the real challenge. The phone vibrated on the table. A new email notification. It was a response from an editor who had read his texts. He said there was something there, a silent force that deserved to be read. He invited Ethan for a conversation. He looked at the screen for a few seconds, then at Ava, who was sleeping with her head on his shoulder. He touched her hair gently and then replied, "Let's talk. I think it's time to tell this story." The first meeting with the editor took place in a discreet corner cafe, on a cloudy morning that seemed tailor-made for serious conversations. Ethan arrived punctually, wearing a light shirt, no blazer, no pretense. He carried no folders or printed drafts, just a well-worn notebook and a direct gaze. On the other side of the table, the editor, a middle-aged man, with an attentive expression and measured speech, opened the conversation by praising his style, the sensitivity of his writing, the depth of his feelings without falling into melodrama. He said there was something about the way Ethan described the ruptures, the silences, the voids, that made each paragraph inevitable. Ethan thanked her with a short but genuine smile. It wasn't modesty, it was incredulity. Until a few months ago, he could barely hear himself think without being overwhelmed by pain. Now, someone saw something in his story that deserved to be shared. Over the next few weeks, they began working together on what would become a book. Not a traditional autobiography, nor fiction disguised as a confession. It was an emotional narrative, built around the anatomy of disillusionment, but stitched with the thin thread of resilience. Each chapter addressed one aspect of the collapse, the imperceptible beginning of distance, the invisible plot of emotional manipulation, the illusion of stability, the sudden collapse, and finally the slow rebuilding. By rewriting his own trajectory, Ethan rediscovered parts of himself that he had left buried. He noticed nuances that, in the whirlwind of pain, he had not been able to identify. And as he did, something began to change not only in his writing, but also in his daily choices. The routine took on a different flavor. Small rituals, like preparing coffee or caring for plants, became acts of presence. For the first time in a long time, living stopped being resistance and became intention. One night, while revising one of the most delicate chapters, he received an unexpected message. It was from an unknown number, but the signature at the end was unmistakable: Olivia. The message was brief. He just said that he had read an excerpt from his text published in a literary column, that he recognized his writing, and that, even without knowing whether he should, he wanted to say something. Ethan sat motionless, phone still in hand, for several minutes. It wasn't anger I felt. It was a strange kind of calm, as if her voice no longer had the power to turn his soul. But he responded succinctly, saying that he was open to listening, as long as it was really necessary. Olivia thanked him and proposed a meeting. She said she didn't expect reconciliation, she just needed to end something that still hurt her in a way that even she couldn't explain. The meeting took place in a park at dusk, far from cafes and closed rooms. She arrived on time, wearing a long coat and the same perfume that he could no longer remember to forget. They sat on a wooden bench, side by side, with a silent lake in front of them and a sky that mixed shades of gray and orange. Olivia started by saying she didn't know where to start, so she got straight to the point. She said that in recent months she had begun an intense process of therapy, and that she had faced not only guilt, but the shame and discomfort of recognizing herself as manipulative. He said he read and reread the emails with Bianca, who cried when he realized how much she had lied to herself, trying to justify choices that had only been made out of fear and vanity. Olivia recognized that she never had the courage to be who she was, and so she tried to be the woman she thought Ethan wanted, but ended up losing herself in versions that even she could no longer maintain. She said that she did love him, at some point, but that this love was always crossed by a constant comparison with Ava, with the idea of perfection that she never achieved. Ethan listened to everything with his eyes fixed on the horizon. When she finished, he just asked what exactly she expected from it. Olivia replied that she didn't expect anything. I wanted him to know that I was trying to be honest for once. That the man he was had been her cruelest mirror, not because he hurt her, but because he forced her, without even knowing it, to face her own lie. Ethan took a deep breath, said he accepted his words, but that they didn't change what it was. He added that forgiving was not forgetting, and that he wished her no harm, just distance. Olivia nodded, tears in her eyes, and said that this would be their last contact. She got up, hoped he would find in Ava what he had never been able to give her, and left. Ethan didn't look back. He sat until the sky was completely dark, feeling not victorious, but at peace. In the following months, the book took final shape. The title chosen was simple, but full of meaning: Unexpectedly Me. A direct reference to the journey of self-discovery that was born from abandonment. The publisher proposed launching it with a small tour of literary events, starting with a book signing at a cultural gallery. Ava was at his side every step of the way, not as the protagonist of his story, but as a witness to the reconstruction. On launch day, the space was full. People he had never seen came to thank him, tell him of their own pain, say that they saw themselves in his words. Ethan was touched by the number of people who carried similar wounds but had never found a voice for them. After hours of autographs, conversations and emotional hugs, he sat next to Ava in the makeshift dressing room at the back of the gallery. They were exhausted, but happy. She took his hand, linked her fingers with his, and said that he had done more than tell a story, he had turned pain into a bridge. Ethan smiled with a slight tiredness and replied that he was only able to do this because, this time, he wasn't alone. But that same night, something unexpected happened. As he left the place, a middle-aged woman approached. His eyes had a disconcerting tenderness and he carried in his hands a copy of the book with the cover already crumpled. He said that he had read it in 2 days, that he had cried in parts, but that he needed to say something. She introduced herself as Cecilia, Ava's aunt. After a few seconds of hesitation, he handed her a sealed envelope and said that Ava didn't know this yet, but that maybe it was time. Ethan took the envelope with his cold hands, thanked him, and the woman left without giving him the chance to ask any more questions. That night, already at home, Ethan opened the envelope. Inside were old letters. All written by Ava, when they were still young. Letters never sent. In them, she talked about a secret she always carried, the reason she broke up with him when she was young. It wasn't just an emotional decision or a natural disagreement. Ava had been blackmailed by a close relative, someone who learned of her father's mistake in a business negotiation and threatened to expose everything if she didn't stay away from Ethan. The person said he was a danger to the family's image. Young and scared, she gave in. He ended it without explaining, he made excuses, he walked away from the love of his life because of a threat that now seemed as distant as it was absurd. The letters were never delivered because, as he said in the last one, if he was able to follow, perhaps it would be better never to know the truth. Ethan felt his hands shake. That revelation turned everything upside down once again. It wasn't just Olivia who had manipulated a story, it was also life itself, that unpredictable writer, that had shaped destinies with silent cruelty. He stayed up all night, reading and rereading those letters. I thought about how much a gesture, a silence, a lie, could change the entire course of two lives. In the morning, Ava showed up at his apartment with croissants and the smile he already associated with a new kind of security. Ethan received her gently, but with eyes that carried a new weight. They sat on the living room floor, like old times. He placed the letters in front of her without saying anything. Ava looked, recognized, and the silence that followed was more eloquent than any argument. She cried, but didn't defend herself. He just said he never thought he would forgive. That he was afraid of losing the chance to start over by bringing all that up. Ethan responded that forgiveness didn't come with perfection, it came with understanding. That now, more than ever, he understood how cruel time can be, but it could also be fair, if it gave them another chance. Ava just hugged him. And in that embrace, there was no guilt. There was redemption. However, one decision remained. Tell this part of the story in the book or not. Making it public implied touching Ava's family wounds. Keeping it hidden meant preserving a pain that could perhaps serve as a mirror for others. For days, Ethan pondered. He thought about how the truth can free or hurt. How love, even when it is reborn, needs to be respected within its borders. The decision he would make in the coming weeks would define not only the ending of the book, but the direction of his new life. Because sometimes telling a story honestly isn't just an act of courage. It is also an act of love. And this time, Ethan knew that love couldn't just be feelings. It needed to be a choice. Conscious choice. Definitive choice. Choose, above all, free. The final decision on whether or not to include Ava's letters in the book came one silent dawn, when Ethan was walking alone down an almost deserted street, aimlessly, only feeling the cold wind hit his face as a reminder that life will never be completely controllable. He had spent days rereading every part of the work, reliving every choice, every pain, every gesture that had transformed him. Cecilia's words still echoed in her mind, sometimes, the truth only makes sense when it is not told to everyone. He finally understood that true love doesn't need an audience, it doesn't need public justifications. He decided to preserve that part, not as a secret, but out of respect. Not because of the shame of the past, but because of the intimacy that deserved to live only between the two of them. The book would be released without the letters. And with that choice, he sealed the definitive transition between the injured man and the healed man. Because keeping a part of the story is not the same as hiding it. Sometimes it's just protecting what no longer needs to be exposed. The official launch was a success. Crowded tables, packed auditoriums, emotional readers who waited hours for an autograph or a quick conversation. Ethan heard stories of betrayals, of new beginnings, of long silences and late decisions. People who had lost everything and were standing there saying, "Thank you for putting into words what I could never say out loud." And that was what gave it meaning. It wasn't recognition, it wasn't profit. It was the feeling of having converted his own fall into a bridge for others. His pain had stopped being a scar and had become a lighthouse. And every time someone said, "I thought it was just me," he understood that it was worth going through all that. Ava, in turn, decided to end a cycle that had gone on for too long. He resigned from the office where he had worked for years and started his own project, simpler, more intimate, focused on mediating family conflicts. He wanted to use his experience to prevent stories like theirs from being repeated. In the first few months, it was difficult. There were nights when she cried in silence, feeling the insecurity of the new, the uncertain, the instability. But next to Ethan, each step felt firmer. He didn't push her, but he didn't let her stop either. They were together not because they needed to, but because they chose to be. And that made all the difference. One morning, when she woke up and saw a note from him on the table saying, "I'll be back soon, I went to get our favorite breads," she understood that true love didn't need to be intense all the time. Just be constant. And there, in that simple gesture, was all the depth she had never found in past loves. Olivia reappeared for the last time, months later, through an interview published in a specialized architecture magazine. He was talking about his new social project, in a distant city, where he worked on rebuilding community spaces. In the article, he said that he had lived through difficult times and that he now understood the value of transparency. Who dedicated himself to building places with soul because he had spent years living in structures without truth. It was a discreet statement, but full of symbolism. Ethan read the interview without rancor. Just with a strange kind of compassion. Not for her. But for the woman who, at some point in her life, lost herself. There was no desire for a reunion. No need for closure. That was just a whispered punchline. And sometimes that is the most powerful point of all. The book entered the bestseller list. But Ethan turned down invitations for sensationalized shows, invasive interviews, or publishing contracts that required exploring more of the personal side of the story. He knew how far he could go. And more than that, I knew what I didn't want to relive again. Fame didn't corrupt him. On the contrary, it brought him even closer to the essence he had rediscovered in the midst of chaos. His routine remained simple. He ran every morning, had coffee with Ava on the apartment's terrace, wrote down his reflections calmly and visited social projects where he talked to young people who saw him as a reference for overcoming obstacles. And even with all this, he never set himself as an example. He said he wasn't better than anyone else. He had just chosen not to wallow in pain. And that was his biggest lesson. One evening, after an outdoor reading event in late fall, Ethan and Ava walked through an empty square. The dry leaves formed a silent carpet underfoot. They sat on an old bench, wrapped in their own coats. He took a small velvet box from his pocket. Ava looked at him with a mixture of amazement and a smile, but he interrupted her before she could say anything. He said it wasn't a traditional request. That I didn't want to promise eternity, nor build a new fantasy. He just wanted to say, with that gesture, that he was ready to stay with her every day, that she also wanted to stay with him. No obligation. No pressure. Just with truth. Ava opened the box and smiled. Inside there were two simple, plain rings without inscriptions. She took one out, put it on his finger, and then held out her hand for him to do the same. There was no applause, no witnesses. Just two mature hearts that, after so much pain, finally found the chance to love without fear. Meanwhile, Bianca, the one who was once just a bridge between farce and revelation, also followed an unexpected path. Created a support network for women involved in abusive and dysfunctional relationships. I shared other people's stories, promoted meetings, wrote articles. And in one of those meetings, he met Olivia again. The two stared at each other for long seconds. They didn't hug. They didn't apologize. They just looked at each other. And that was enough. There was no reconciliation. But there was a kind of silent truce. As if they both knew that the war had already ended. Each in their own way, both were trying to do things differently. And that, for that moment, was enough. Time passed. Ethan has published other books. Some more introspective, others almost poetic. He never wrote about betrayal again. Not out of fear, but out of respect for history itself. The pain that pushed him to write had accomplished its mission. Now, I wrote about presence, about daily choices, about small details that make up a real life. In one of these books, he wrote a sentence that remained with his readers: "The love that saves is the one that allows itself to be lived even after everything seems irremediable." It was simple, but it carried within it the memory of everything he had experienced. And of everything he decided to build after surviving the ruin. And if you've made it this far, I now invite you to share in the comments what you thought of this story. How did she touch you? What impacted you most? Here on the channel, we value stories that show that the truth always finds a way to emerge, even when they try to bury it. And we firmly remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. All the stories told here are fictional, but they carry the real pain of those who have felt their world collapsing. If you also value true love, the courage to start over and the importance of living honestly, sign up now and activate the bell. There's a lot more coming. And above all, never forget, the greatest proof of love is not lying to someone who gives you their entire heart. Until the next story.